Well, hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message this week. I hope that you've had a special Thanksgiving weekend, even though things have looked different this year than in other years. Last week, before Thanksgiving, we started to look at a story that I'd like to read today from Luke chapter 17. This is what it says. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." So last week we looked at the story for part of our time together, and I challenged us to reflect on the fact that the leper who came back still had a life that was characterized by loss. He'd been estranged from his family. He had been quarantined or banished to live outside of the village, and had lost contact with his family, probably lost his job, and probably lost a whole lot more than that. Those losses hadn't yet been recovered. His life was far from fully restored, yet he returned and he gave thanks to Jesus, praising God, even though everything was not the way that he would have wanted it. And I hope that as a result, this Thanksgiving week, you were able to consider the blessings that are yours, even during a holiday season where perhaps we have felt more lost this year than we have in most other years, maybe all other years. Because many of you didn't get to be with your family this year, like Nancy and I weren't able to be. Many of you have a family member who has gotten sick from the COVID virus. Financially, it has been a bad year for many people. Many people are tired from the never-ending isolation, and that could be true for you as well. Today, I want to build on those thoughts from last week, this concept of, okay, we can thank God even though there are still lingering losses in our lives. I want to build on that by looking at 3 things that our Thanksgiving communicates to God. I know last week I said there'd be 4. As I started to study them this week, it would have been way too long of a message for me to have mentioned all 4 of them. So we're going to look at 3. My hope is that you will see gratitude in a new light, and that it would make a difference in how you live. It would make a difference in your attitude moving forward, because it has done so for me. So 3 things that our Thanksgiving communicates to God. The first is this: humility. I am not great enough to get along by myself. Notice where the leper is giving thanks from. It says he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. The words literally mean that he flung his face down into the dust right at Jesus' feet, groveling in the dust. At the feet, the dirty feet of another person would have been among the most humbling things that a Jewish person could do. Having just been made clean, and the previous verse speaks about how on the way, they were all cleansed, so having just been made clean, he casts his clean person back into the dirt again at Jesus' unclean feet. Gratitude humbly has us telling God from the dust that he is strong, that he is great, and that we are not. And that humility before him, at his feet, it honors him greatly. Now I want to get a little bit more specific here, because there's a particular obstacle for us that I think is unique to us as Americans that we need to overcome in this area, all right? You see, throughout our lifetimes, more than any other country, America has been the leader in the world. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, not with the best motives all the time, but certainly we have been the most influential. We most heavily influence worldwide endeavors. We usually respond most generously to natural disasters in other parts of the world. We're usually the most influential regarding treaties and trade. We win the most Olympic medals most of the times when there are Olympic Games. We have the largest economy. We are the greatest consumers of food and oil and water and minerals. And most importantly, we eat more lutefisk than any other people on earth. We lead, you see, in every important category, especially that most important one, the lutefisk one. All right, but our preeminence in so many of these things makes America the perfect soil in which national and personal pride flourishes. Over the years, when Nancy and I have had gardens, our gardens always seemed to be the most favorable place for weeds to grow. I would plant onion seeds, for example, and if we weren't diligent in pulling out the weeds early on, the onions would get overwhelmed. And then at times, as I'd be pulling out big weeds next to a small little onion plant, the onion would come out as well. All right? Soil that favors the growth of noxious weeds requires diligence in removing them. And if not, the weeds become noxious-er. Military and economic dominance on the part of us as Americans, the ability to control so many of the trends regarding popular culture, they make our national soil perfect for arrogance to flourish. This battle is going to be harder for our country than it would be for most other places in the world. Now, pride is everywhere, there's no question about it, but when you are a leader, pride is really, really evident. And that makes Thanksgiving, I think, our most necessary and our most practical holiday. So a principle that I see here is the proactive commandments of God will always help us avoid a particular sin. So when God commands us in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 18, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. That God's will part includes his will that we not become arrogant. How do we fight back against that? Thanksgiving. Gratitude. Gratitude says, I neither deserve, nor am I entitled to, nor could I ever possibly earn all of the blessings that I humbly enjoy from the hand of God and from others. That humility of gratitude spills over into the second aspect of Thanksgiving, and that is this. Thanksgiving communicates to God our reliance on him. Those two are tied closely together, I know. Meaning, I need God and I need the people around me that God has put in my life. 9 lepers moved on immediately after they got healed, as though they thought, we've got it from here. We can handle this now. The one leper who came back revealed how much he was aware of his reliance on God and certainly his reliance on other people as well. When I reflected on this, I realized that the responses of these 9 lepers is very predictable because I see parallels to our world. You see, these lepers' greatest apparent need was completely outside their realm of control. Lepers never healed themselves. In fact, there was nobody who healed lepers. So they are totally at the mercy of God. Which is why they call out, Jesus, Master, have pity on us, in verse 13. Nobody else's pity has removed their problem from them. So they should at least cry out to this Jesus rabbi, who they may or may not yet have believed was actually the Son of God, or God the Son in flesh. But then when their greatest problem is removed, their responses indicate that they are, for the 9, that they aren't reliant on others for anything else. And they certainly aren't reliant on God for anything else. And that's probably consistent with how they lived much of their lives. And it's consistent with how we live much of our lives. The independent spirit that characterizes so many of us as Americans, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. But to get a sense of our reliance on others, let me suggest an exercise for you this week. Guys, I encourage you to do this. Go into your garage sometime, or go downstairs where you might have a workshop or a workbench All right? And make a list. Take along a piece of paper and a pen and make a list of everything in your garage that you can make from scratch. Any of the tools that you can make from scratch, anything else that you've got in there, yard equipment or anything like that. Ladies, you could do the same thing in your kitchen. So for me, what I did is I went out into our garage and I took a picture of my workbench area. And as I looked at everything in my workbench area, here's what I realized. I couldn't even make the simplest thing that was on the workbench. And that was a simple architect's or carpenter's pencil. Couldn't do that. We got a chop saw, and the outflow for that, I lost the bag a while back, and so I needed to have a bag to put on there, and all I couldn't even make that. I used an old sock to do it with a rubber band that ties it in there to collect the sawdust that comes out of the saw. Seriously, just the things on my workbench alone. Not the rest of the things in the garage, not the stuff in my house, nothing in my car. Just the things on my workbench indicate that I am reliant literally on thousands of other people for the things that I call my own. Then I thought of this. Even if I could somehow gather together everyone who has helped make all of the things just on my workbench, if I could gather all of them together combined, we could still not be able to make anything without the raw materials that only God can create. We think of hell oftentimes as being the total absence of God, banishment from the presence of God. And that's an accurate description of what heaven will be like, or one of the characteristics or qualities of heaven. But I believe an extended aspect of that is that hell would be the removal of anything good that only God can provide or create. Mankind left on its own to forge an existence out of whatever it can create. Think about that for a moment. It's not a pretty sight. So go back to Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve originally sinned in the Garden of Eden, and this is what we read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. After they have fallen into sin and after they realize that they are naked, we read this. So Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. That was the best that they could manage to do. Fig leaf coverings. Well, good luck with that when there aren't even any fig leaves to use, which ultimately would be something that wouldn't be present in hell. Guys, I think that we are the ones that more commonly think that we are independent. As men, we relish a big truck and the power of a V6 engine or maybe 8 cylinders. We enjoy the roar of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. If you happen to be a biker, we like our power tools. We like our air compressors. There's much about us that wanders into the territory of pride with some of the manly, masculine things that we've got. So there was something that I noticed, though, in this verse in Genesis chapter 3, this week that I hadn't seen before, and it actually made me laugh, okay? If you look at the King James Version of that verse, it speaks about that Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together and made aprons for themselves. The Hebrew word actually is closer to the word for a girdle, like a lady's girdle. In fact, the Hebrew word here can be either a masculine noun, or sometimes it can be a feminine noun. It's a masculine noun when it's used in different areas in the Bible, but in this particular verse, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, the Hebrew word that is used here is not a masculine, it's the feminine version of the noun, all right? Ladies, don't take offense at this, okay? I am not saying anything negative about you here at all. Okay, because I think it's men that have the greater problem with the pride about independence, being able to take care of ourselves and be able to handle life on our own. Okay, I am simply pointing out that men with their macho masculinity should trace our abilities back to Adam, the first man, who when faced with his first task of fixing something that goes wrong, his best efforts result in a woman's girdle. Guys, genuine gratitude must lead us to true acceptance of our reliance on others and on God. And that is true for ladies as well. An attitude of reliance, what it does is it liberates us from a faulty expectation that we can do it all ourselves, that we've got this figured out and we'll be able to make it on our own. That's not true. Gratitude and thanksgiving ends up making it so that it's okay that we can't take care of all of our needs on our own. Listen to what Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1, starting at verse 15, from verses 15 through 17. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, remember that line, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So, 2 lines from this. In him all things were created. In him all things hold together. Christ the Creator, Christ the Sustainer. And the only appropriate response to that is a humble, grateful attitude of reliance upon God and reliance upon the people that God has blessed our lives with. Thanksgiving communicates that back to God. And it allows God to remain God in our hearts. And then the third thing I want to say today is this. Thanksgiving communicates value. Pretty basic. Gratitude says, I recognize the cost involved in the giving of what I have received. I read a book a while back called Wonderstruck, written by an author named Margaret Feinberg. And she writes about gratitude, and she says this: the wonder in our hearts arises when we express gratitude in situations that appear to deserve none. In situations that appear that no gratitude is warranted, when we still show gratitude, there is a certain wonder or awe-inspiring aspect of why we would still be grateful when others would not be. On the surface, our situations during this Thanksgiving might appear to merit little gratitude and no value from God. But that is simply not true. Now, I'm going to speculate here, but knowing human nature, this is what I believe. If there had been 10 lepers who had lost years of their lives, we have no idea how long they were lepers. Some might have been for 2 years, some might have been for 20 years, okay? But if there were 10 lepers who had lost years of their lives, stuck outside the edge of the village, and believed that God had allowed it to happen, and it's certainly likely that their thoughts would have gone that direction because our thoughts go that direction sometimes. And then if they were healed from it, some of them almost certainly would have thought, give thanks? Follow that other guy back and give thanks? No way, he's a Samaritan. I'm not following him in the first place. The Jews would have thought that. All right, but give thanks, what for? To a God who allowed my life to be ruined for 15 years? I'm not going to give thanks. I deserve an apology for what was wrongfully taken from me all these years. I'm only getting back what was wrongfully taken from me in the first place. The one leper who returns, though, puts God, the Hebrew God that was not part of his faith framework, he puts God in his rightful place of value. And this leper gets something in return that none of the others receive. He gets a deeper insight. He gets a more clear picture. He sees things comprehensively that doesn't just look at the healing as being something that happens to him physically, but a part of his spirit and his soul have been eternally touched by Christ the Creator, Christ the Sustainer, Christ the Healer, in ways that he'll understand that the other 9 never would. Because at the end of the story, this is what Jesus declares. Luke 17, verse 19, he says to the man, he says, rise and go. Your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you whole. Your faith has returned you to wholeness. He is commending the man for his expression of faith. Only the one who gives thanks comes to the understanding that it's more than just his body that is being made whole. His spirit has been made new as well. And he gains that valuable insight by placing himself within earshot of Jesus' voice. If he hadn't come back to give thanks, he never would have had this greater perspective granted to him by Jesus. But he never would have understood the spiritual wholeness of his heart as well. And that only comes about because he chose to be grateful. So this communicates value in two ways. We communicate that we understand both the value of what we have received, okay, by going back, the value of the healing that he has received, that gets communicated back to the giver. But second part of it is, far more importantly, we also accord value to the person who has given it to us. And it can be seen circling around to that first element of thanksgiving communicates humility. From Paul's writing, if we look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, it says this: in humility, Paul says, value others above yourselves. When we don't show gratitude, it exemplifies a pride that values ourselves over the value of others around us. Returning to acknowledge the value of the person giving to us, I want to reflect for a few minutes before we wrap this up on a story about King David. At the end of his reign, some of you are familiar with this, and I spoke about it actually a few months ago, but at the end of his reign, King David had a prideful desire in his heart to take a census of the fighting men, the men of fighting age in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And so he sends out his men to go and take that census, even though he's been warned not to do that. When they come back with the figure, he is stricken in his heart about the pride motivation that caused him to do it. And as a result of that, God says that he is going to be punished. And the punishment that ends up taking place is that God allows a plague to infect the people of Israel and to strike them down over a period of 3 days, okay? Certainly worse than COVID, okay, because people were dying by the thousands from this plague within a matter of just hours upon this plague moving into their various villages. David then, after the plague has been going on for over 2 days, okay, we're into the third day of it now, David is stricken in his conscience. He cries out to God for deliverance, and he ends up being nudged by God to offer a sacrifice of repentance in humility before God. And the location for the sacrifice that he chooses is in the city of Jerusalem, on a threshing floor that is owned by a man named Araunah. But Araunah offers David that land, that threshing floor. He offers it to him free of charge, and he says, I will supply the oxen for the sacrifice. I will supply wheat for a grain sacrifice. In addition to that, you can take my threshing, you can take the wood from my implements, and you can cut them up to use them as the wood of the fire. That's how desperate he was for this plague to stop among the people around him. But David refuses, because his heart intends to honor God, and that isn't done by a sacrifice that costs him nothing. And this is what we read in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 24. But King David replied to Araunah, no, I insist on paying the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, or sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing. And then verse 25 adds this detail. So David paid Araunah 600 shekels. Now, if you go back to the numbers of those days, and if you do the math, 600 shekels appears to equal out about 15 pounds, all right? So 15 pounds of gold. Multiply those 15 pounds by 16 ounces each, and you have 240 ounces of gold. If somebody today had 240 ounces of gold, I think the last I looked, and I should have checked this out, more recently, the price of gold is a little bit less than $2,000 an ounce right now. So if you figured it maybe at $1,900, that is about $450,000 in today's economy. that is an enormous sum of gold that David pays for the land, which happens to be the land now that we know as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. 450,000 would be nowhere near the price or the value of that land. $450 million wouldn't even be adequate to be able to say, claim it and say, I'm buying this, this is mine. It is too sacred for that. That sacrifice on that threshing, on that hill of the threshing floor, was to honor God and return to a position of blessability before Him. Gratitude does that. Gratitude fixes value on the gift. It fixes value on God. And when we do that, we open the door for God to bless us as well. David recognizes the cost involved in the giving. So giving thanks communicates God's value and the value of His gifts. It communicates our own humility, and it communicates our reliance on God and our reliance on others. And I asked myself the question this week that I've oftentimes asked in the past, but I haven't been doing it recently, and that is, so what? So what? Well, here's what I found. When I took the time this week to simply stop and to reflect intentionally on these aspects of Thanksgiving, soaking my spirit at the same time in some of my most favorite worship songs that elevate God for who He is, songs of thanksgiving, songs of praise and honor to Him. Here's what took place. I found that my heart got anchored far more firmly into contentment. It simply became impossible to make room in my heart for pride when the appropriate place for me to give thanks would be at the dusty feet of the Messiah. It became impossible to be discouraged when I realized that all that I have has been reliant not on my own abilities, but on God's provision and on blessings that I receive from God through other people and their skills. And it became impossible to wallow in self-pity when my eyes were open to the greater value of a relationship with God as opposed to a 3-day weekend with the kids at home that we ended up missing out on this year, like many of you. But I believe my time spent in thanksgiving in those moments honored God far more than our tradition at Thanksgiving, which has oftentimes been to sit around the table with an amazing meal in front of us and to take turns one by one. Why don't you say what you are thankful for? That's a good tradition. This one here far surpassed it in its meaningfulness to me, and I believe also in the way it honors God. Let's bow for a word of prayer. In a world, God, where it might not make sense to a lot of people why we should be giving thanks this year, when so much has been stripped away from us, when so much has been lost, oh God, would you help us to be people of gratitude and thanksgiving, communicating to you, God, our humility, that just like that leper, the most appropriate place for us to be before you would be down in the dust with the cleanest part of our bodies, our faces, down right at your feet. Would you know, God, that our willingness to choose thanksgiving intentionally indicates also our reliance on you, on how you alone provide for our needs. You alone have created everything that is out there. You alone sustain everything, but then how you have provided skills that others have to be able to take what you have created and make it into something that is useful for us. And then, God, I pray that our hearts thanksgiving and gratitude to you would also just communicate back to you our value for the gifts that we have received and the value that we place on the one who has given to us those gifts. Much of the rest of the world struggled this week, or much of the rest of our country, our American brothers and sisters, struggled this week to be content, to be grateful, and to show thanksgiving. Forgive us if we have been among those. God, work in our hearts day by day, week by week, month by month. to live lives of true gratitude before you. You are so worthy of it. In Christ's name I pray these things. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. I do hope that you have a wonderful week filled with gratitude.